Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Green from the Andre Mitchell Center. Thank you for being with us this snowy afternoon. We're very excited to continue on with our year-long program, Democracy in Trouble, which is now having today its third event as part of a year-long series. And I want to thank Mitchell Orenstein, the program chair of this series, along with the rest of the planning committee, for helping to organize today's event. Today's event deals with human mobility, and human mobility has many meanings. One basic meaning of mobility is simply going to another country to visit, as a tourist, let's say. And in this past year, there were 1.3 billion visits from one country to another. Mobility can also mean migration. When you go from your home country to live in another country for work purposes or for personal reasons, or for increasingly climate-based reasons. And in the world today, there are 250 million individuals who are migrants in this sense. But then there's a category of mobility that is more severe and dire, and that's forced displacement. And in the world today, there are 66 million people who have been displaced from their homes, 44 million to another place within their country, and 22 million to a foreign country, and thus as refugees. And in addition to that 22 million, there are an additional 3 million today who are seeking asylum to become refugees. And overall, the 66 million people who have endured forced displacement has doubled from the 33 million back in 1997. So it's a constituency that is growing here in the 21st century. And we see the politics of human mobility all around us. In South Asia, the orchestrated campaign to destroy the Rohingya Muslim minority in Burma has meant that 700,000 Rohingya have been forced to flee Myanmar over the past year, and perhaps more than 10,000 have been killed in the crisis. In Kenya, there are almost 500,000 refugees in the Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps, with new generations of children growing up in stateless conditions. In Europe, 1.8 million refugees have come into the continent since 2014, with more than 1 million coming in 2015 alone, making the situation the largest movement of refugees and migrants in Europe since World War II. In the US, where debates about immigration sometimes seem to parallel those in Europe, there is the striking difference that there is no such large uptick of refugees and migrants coming into this country compared to previous years, reminding us that immigration debates can play as much on fear, fantasy, and misinformation as on objective criteria. To be sure, there has been a dramatic increase in Central American migration as the number of asylum seekers and refugees who have abandoned the region increased from 18,000 in 2011 to over 290,000 last year. And this represents a genuine crisis in the region, though its impact on surrounding countries remains unclear. The politics of human mobility is one reason to raise the issue of democratic society's responsibility to refugees and other migrants, and ask more generally about the relationship between immigration and democracy. Such questions, I think, demand the work of our three guests who are with us this evening. Ariane Chabel d'Apollonia is currently professor at the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers, Newark, and an associated senior researcher with the Center for Political Research at Sciences Po. She's the author of 8 books and numerous chapters and articles on the securitization of immigration policy, the politics of racism and xenophobia, and European responses to radicalization. She is also the creator and co-director of the Securitization of Migrant Integration Research Network, and previously co-director of the Immigration and Security Initiative Research Network, both of which convene transatlantic groups of scholars on the securitization of immigration. As Didier Bigot has described Chabel d'Apollonia's work, it engages with a reader who asks, why are my fears about immigrants not legitimate? One book that especially does this is Chabel d'Apollonia's 2012 book, Frontiers of Fear, Immigration and Insecurity in Europe and the United States, which was the subject of a book review symposium in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. Her newest book project, Ethno-Racial Violence, Multi-Ethnic Grievances and Identity Politics, Lessons from America, is under contract with Cornell University Press. Elizabeth Cohen is Associate Professor of Political Science and Senior Research Associate at the Campbell Public Affairs Institute at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Her research concerns the theoretical and historical foundations of immigration and citizenship policies. Her own family having been left stateless after World War II, Cohen has commented that the abiding theme of my work is what gets lost in between things. Her first book, Semi-Citizenship in Democratic Politics, focuses on individuals who hold some, but not all elements of full democratic citizenship. Her second book, The Political Value of Time, Citizenship, Duration, and Democratic Justice, was published this year by Cambridge University Press and explores the various ways that we use time, such as waiting periods and deadlines, to create boundaries around citizenship. Her articles have been published in the leading political science journals, among other outlets. Cohen is also active in policy conversations regarding immigration. As a visiting scholar with the Russell Sage Foundation in 2014-15, she contributed to efforts to enfranchise undocumented immigrants, and she has written op-eds for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico, and this year presented on her work at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Strategy Summit. P.J. Brindisi is Assistant Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship Program at Johns Hopkins University. A self-described question-driven scholar, Brindisi writes on the politics of race, memory, and temporality through the lens of political theory. His first book, The Power of Memory in Democratic Politics, employs comparative cases around the world, including ancient Greece, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Mexico after the so-called Dirty War, to explore the political dynamics of collective memory. He is also the editor of a forthcoming volume entitled A Political Companion to Toni Morrison, the author of numerous articles published in leading outlets, and an acclaimed teacher at Hopkins. Brindisi is currently at work on a second solo-authored book project called The Race of Segregated Time, which investigates the temporal dimensions through which racism is experienced. Finally, our moderator for today is Osman Balkan, who got his PhD in political science from Penn in 2016 and currently is a professor at Swarthmore, where he teaches comparative politics. Balkan is also director of the Europe Summer Regional Program at Penn's Lauder Institute. The author of numerous works on the politics of belonging, Balkan focuses especially on necropolitics, or how death exerts political force in the maintenance of sovereignty in contemporary states. This research has led him to publish numerous works on how the dead bodies of individuals hostile to a given state are treated by that state, such as in the case of the bodies of coup plotters in the 2016 attempted coup in Turkey, or the Charlie Hebdo attacks, in which the bodies of attackers and victims were treated in radically different ways, and the politics of burial surrounding the Boston Marathon attack. Beyond these cases, it should be mentioned that Balkan's current book project concerns the necropolitics related to Turkish communities in Germany, and specifically the way death and mourning are experienced by Turkish immigrants who do not necessarily consider Germany their home. Before I turn things over to Osman, I'll just conclude by mentioning all year long in our Democracy in Trouble series, we have a partnership with local area high school students and college students at Penn who are teaching those students on a course titled Democracy in Trouble, which investigates the matter from a Latin American perspective, and we're grateful to our partner, Penn's Latin American and Latino Studies program. Thank you all for being here, who could make it here in the weather. So we appreciate that partnership and look forward to continuing connections this year with our students coming from the high school and college level. So thank you, and Osman, we turn things over to you.
Okay, here we go. Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. It's a great honor for me to be sharing the stage with scholars whose work has been a huge influence on my own thinking about immigration and democracy. So thank you very much to the Mitchell Center, to Jeff, and to Mitchell as well for this invitation to moderate this panel. I'll start maybe with a few observations and questions. I'll turn the floor over then to our panelists who will deliver some comments, and then we can open it up for Q&A and discussion. So when I was thinking about immigration and democracy, there's a number of ways in which these two topics intersect. First, in thinking about the very meaning of the word democracy, rooted in the concept of demos, or the people, how does migration challenge who we understand to be the people? Where are the boundaries? How is the political community constituted? And how does the demos have to engage with diversity and difference? What are the challenges posed by diversity and difference for contemporary democracies? Second, and the second meaning of democracy, kratian, to rule. To what extent does migration challenge existing conceptions of sovereignty, of authority, of governance? To what extent can the demos dictate the terms under which itself is constituted as a community? And how is migration itself related to broader questions around sovereignty, security, control? We often think about borders, border walls. Immigration has become, in many senses, a discourse around security, for better or for worse. Now, these are some questions that political theorists might consider when thinking about immigration and democracy. Is immigration good or bad for democracy? A comparative politics might approach the question in a bit of a different way, as my colleague Trolls pointed out. You might ask the question, is democracy good or bad for immigration? In what senses do different regimes, do different forms of governance either are more open to, more closed to immigration? How is immigration restriction or openness tied to how we understand democracy, liberal democracy versus other forms of governance? So just a few thoughts to put on the table. And furthermore, the last thing I'll say about this is when we think about this question, is immigration good or bad for democracy, or good or bad for anything? I think some of the questions that necessarily follow up is good or bad for who? For whom? How does immigration affect different constituencies within a political society? In what ways does it harm or help various groups? And how might we try to understand the celebration or backlash to democracy by paying attention to the distributional questions, the sort of material questions, and the symbolic questions to what effects the arrival of newcomers has on existing populations in a given territory. So I want to turn the floor over to Ariane first, who points out in her paper that debates about whether immigration is good or bad, you say, are sterile for a number of reasons. First of all, owing to a lack of definitional clarity, this kind of simplistic use of dichotomies, obscuring some of the more difficult questions around migration, and that both liberal and restrictionist perspectives fail to address some of these core relationships between immigration and democracy. So I would invite you first, if you may, to expand on some of these points that you've made in your paper.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction, for the invitation, and for you attending this event. So the question we're supposed to answer tonight is immigration good or bad for democracy? So this is a topical question, a big one. And I'm supposed to give you some ideas in 10 minutes. I'm sure I don't have time to reach my conclusion, so I'm going to, that's a spoil alert. The key argument of my conclusion is that the so-called issues raised by immigration, broadly defined, are actually symptoms of a more global crisis of Western democracies. I'd like to consider immigration not as raising issues, but as a test for democratic institutions, democratic values, democratic practices. And instead of arguing the pro and cons, I would prefer that decision makers, politicians, I'm quite idealistic, try to focus on what we really need to discuss, meaning the contour and the goals of a true democratic management of diversity, because immigration is only one part of diversity. And when we talk about immigration, there are two stages that we need to consider. The first one is who is allowed to enter in the country. And the second one is what happened after. And I think that what happened after is even more important than the selection of who is allowed to enter the country. So we have stage number one, who is allowed to enter the country. We have these sterile dichotomies, the good and bad immigrants, wanted, unwanted immigration, closed borders, open borders, and so on. It makes no sense because there are many gray zones. And when you work on immigration, you're dealing with gray zones. Open border, this is very nice, but this is not sustainable. Closed borders, well, maybe it sounds reassuring. It's not working. There is one golden rule when you work on immigration is that more border control increase the number of illegal immigrants. So if you want to increase the number of illegal immigrants in one country, you strengthen border controls. Okay? So that's my key argument. And how do I reach this argument is, as you said, there are three key limitations to the current debates. The first one relates to the lack of clear definitions. Immigration, what does it mean? What kind of immigration? Economic immigration, highly skilled workers, voluntary immigration or forced migration, refugees, asylum seekers, temporary migration, permanent migration. We don't know exactly what we're talking about. And I'm always pissed off when there is the debates and people say, well, this is good, this is bad. And as you said, what kind of migrants are good or bad? What are the criteria? Is it economic criteria? They're good because they pick up our oranges, or they're very techy and thank you, Silicon Valley. Is it a good immigrant, or is it a European immigrant? Is it a non-Muslim immigrant? Meaning we all know who are the bad immigrants by default. But do we need to base our migration policy on this kind of distinction? I think this is wrong. And the second aspect of that when there is no clear definitions, people tend to overestimate the scale of migration. On average in Europe, for example, when you ask people how many immigrants live in your country, broadly defined, they tend to overestimate the size of migrant communities by 25%. When you ask people how many Muslims live in your country, people tend to overestimate by 3, 4, 5 times the size of so-called Muslim communities. And you understand that this fuels a nativist propaganda notion of we are invaded or the great replacement. So actually you mentioned in your presentation the refugee crisis in Europe. Well, they're not all refugees. This is not exactly a crisis because all the people who arrived in emergency represent still less than 1% of the European population, less than 1%. And the majority of them will be deported back in a third country or their country of origin. So that's my first point. The second point is that we can't have simplistic dichotomies like, as I said, closed border, open borders. What does it mean? When you say border controls, people tend to focus on sending, for example, the military to the border. Okay, why not? But this is only one aspect of border control. There is one aspect which is much more important and easy to fix. It's the visa policy. You change the visa policy and you solve many of the problem at the so-called physical borders. In this country, 40% of illegal immigrants are visa overstayers. Why? Because it's so difficult to go back and forth that once you're here, you tend to overstay. I'm not saying that I don't have the magic solution, or I will, have a patent and a copyright on it, and I will be a millionaire. But there are some issues that are very easy to fix, okay? To reform the H1B, H2, and so on, this is very easy to do. And second, related to that, you have some liberals, and I'm part of them, so, that's the masochist aspect of my presentation tonight, saying that, oh, immigration is good because it increased diversity. Okay, that's very nice, but what is diversity? What kind of diversity? And the idea that diversity is good in itself makes no sense. Diversity needs to be managed, to be organized. And this is my third point. That's the relationship between immigration, good or bad for democracy, and what we really need to think about, to focus, to work on it, is the democratic management of migration and subsequent diversity. So, threat to democracy, is it a threat to state sovereignty? No, absolutely not. Immigration is a human right. That's quite recent, but everybody has the right to leave the country of origin. Okay, immigration is not a universal right. The states are in control. Who is allowed to enter the country is the preserve of sovereign national states. So, the Leviathan is not dead, the Western state is still working. So that's not a threat to state sovereignty. If there is more illegal immigrants, this is not due to the decline of sovereignty. It's only due to failed policies, bad politics. There is nothing to do with state sovereignty. So, to send more patrols, more military at the border to restore state sovereignty or national security, it doesn't work. It's even counterproductive. The second point is that the idea that immigrants, always broadly defined, pose a threat to national values, societal cohesion, and so on. And this perspective fuels the racialization of immigrants, the essentialization of their cultural, religious differences. Suddenly, Muslim, it's a race. Okay? There is a racialization of Muslim. So no wonder why some people think that Islam is a country and say, go back to Islam, okay? Because that's part of the dominant narrative. And other people say, well, we need a return to assimilation. Why not? We need common values. We need common grounds. And I think one of the problems in this country today is that there is a lack of common values and common sense and decency. But so return to assimilation, to put pressure on immigrants to integrate, to assimilate into a mainstream. Okay, but what is the mainstream? Can you provide me a clear definition, the clear ingredients of the mainstream today, 20 years ago, and in 20 years? It's not very clear. So, neither democracy immigration is not good or bad for democracy. I think actually this question makes no sense. I mentioned I say that politely, but this question makes no sense. We should instead focus on how to improve the democratic governance of immigration. And the main aspects are, I list a few, a democratic selection of the newcomers. In the US or in the European countries, we don't have a democratic selection of who is allowed to enter the country. There is a complete lack of transparency. We don't know exactly what are the main criteria. This is completely undemocratic, not to mention that the Dublin regime in Europe is a legal violation of the Geneva Convention. Okay? I can give you more if you don't understand that point. The second aspect is integration. Integration is key. What about democratic incorporation in terms of value, in terms of behavior? What about a sense of belonging? Knowing that immigrants, the newcomers, are extremely optimistic. And we, scholars of immigration, call that migrant optimism. They arrive, the first generation, they truly believe they can do it. They're going to make it. Then, second, third generation, there is an increase of alienation, resentment, and this is what we call the integration paradox. Because these people are not integrated, maybe socioeconomically or culturally, but they still feel discriminated against. And guess what? These fuel non-democratic behavior. So that's one of the challenges of the democratic governance of diversity. To do everything to stop undemocratic behavior on behalf of people who are second, third generation homegrown terrorists, for example, to commit acts of terrorism. And finally, what about conventional or unconventional democratic participation? What about access to citizenship? This is not the magic solution, but we know that it helps people to feel part of the community, to feel integrated, assimilated, welcome. But on the other hand, we should not blame immigrants, newcomers, newly naturalized, not to vote. What about natives? We don't vote a lot in the US, and we don't vote a lot in Europe. So when people say, well, you see, Hispanic in the US, for example, they have a very low level of naturalization, and they don't vote. Okay? They have a very low level of political participation. But they're not the only one. So should it be an indicator of integration, of Americanization, of loyalty to the US? I don't think so. Because if so, a lot of natives are also un-American when they don't vote. And immigrants tend to have a very high level of unconventional participation, meaning if they don't vote, they're members of organization, political, religious, civic organization. They organize meetings, rallies, they support political candidates, and so on. So they're very active. So finally, going back to my final argument, that the so-called issues raised by immigration, broadly defined, are symptoms of a global crisis of Western democracies. Immigration should not be perceived as posing a threat. On the other hand, we can't be naive. Immigration raises practical issues that relate to integration. But we also need to fix other aspects when we put pressure on immigrants to assimilate. And the big one is democratic disenchantment. If we don't believe in our institutions, in our democratic values, if we don't promote democratic behavior, well, this is not a good incentive for newcomers and their children to assimilate. That's the main challenge, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to turn the floor over to PJ now. In your essay, you start with the observation that many debates around immigration are understood in terms of population movements across borders, maybe spatial analyses, but that there is less reflection on how the stakes of these debates are framed and contested in terms of time. And you invite us to consider immigration through the lens of race and time, and suggest that by doing so we can see a surprising convergence on what we might take to be ostensibly opposing political ideologies on the left and right. And in doing so, you invite us also to understand immigration through the lens of biopolitics. So I would invite you now, if you might explain a little bit more about what you have in mind with this biopolitical framework, and what do we see when we look at immigration through the lens of time and race rather than space and place.
Thanks, Osman. And I want to second the thanks to the Mitchell Center and to Jeff and, of course, to Osman for convening this, and to all of you for coming out in such a, how shall we say, just not very ideal weather. We were going to be here by ourselves at one point, so thank you. As Osman mentioned, I take the position that we think of immigration in terms of space, but we would do well to think about it temporally as well. Not because thinking about time is going to magically solve our problems, but to add dimension and texture to our lived experience of immigration. And also I kind of wanted to confront a series of questions that I had. Well, why do we talk about immigration in terms of territory and spatiality, but when so many arguments for or against immigration, these days a lot of them against, are cast in terms of time, right? That we have a bunch of neo-nativist arguments on the right about that we need to, take the, they're against our immigration on the grounds of wanting to reclaim an idealized past of patriarchal, white-governed national greatness. These are partisans who are plainly seeking to turn back the clock. That's part of their Make America Great Again rhetoric. There's also right-wing rallying cries that express a desire for protection against those who they view as advancing too fast. Those whose respective differences are stigmatized as being backward, less evolved, or otherwise behind the times. And if you were to go through, say, the writings of Martin Luther King, he's constantly talking about time, right? So there's a way in which racial inequalities are often experienced as impositions on human time, and so too are oppositions to those inequalities cast in temporal terms. I mean, for King, Negroes are not moving too fast, why we can't wait, this is, and so on and so forth. The problem for those on the right of these people who are moving too fast, and we know who these people are, is that it's only accelerated by what they view as queue-jumping foreigners, people who either refuse to wait their turn or refuse to accept the fact that they're of their own indefinite banishment. Now, with banishment being the one that I hear more often as a preference among those who frequently invoke an epidemiological rhetoric of infestation, of immigrants as vectors of disease. There's a historical precedent for that kind of rhetoric, and it never ends well. Likewise, the immigration in terms of an invasion, the militant discourse. So from the standpoint of time, then, I think that we should think of calls, for example, to build the wall as we should hear them as temporal desires expressed in spatial terms, as not just the other way around. Now, on the left, and this is the kind of strange convergence that Osman was talking about, I would argue we frequently hear some uncritical valorization of pro-immigrant stances, valorization of immigrants in terms of their labor. That is, the logic, thought about Barack Obama, for example, saying immigrants do the jobs that Americans can't do or won't do. Well, let's think about that. The logic that immigrants do the jobs that Americans won't do. Well, what are those jobs? They tend to be dirty jobs, low-paying jobs, dangerous jobs, jobs that are not always secured by worker protection rights. Okay, what are the jobs that Americans can't do? And if we think about Barack Obama, who certainly traffics in the rhetoric of American exceptionalism, i.e., if you're American, there's nothing you can't do. You are blessed with a boundless horizon of endless possibility. It's really hard to imagine, somebody like President Obama saying, because you're American, there's just some things you just can't do. That logic makes sense, though, if we start to conceive. I think the only way it makes sense is if we conceive of citizenship in terms of status, that there's certain jobs that are beneath an American to do. So either stated or implied, there's a working premise that a steady supply, I think, of cheap labor, of cheap and plentiful immigrant workers is necessary, furthermore, to provide citizens with the accoutrements of 21st century digital capitalism, even if it means that those newcomers toil in conditions that are more evocative of the 19th century. So I think when we examine these issues from the aperture of race and time, ostensibly opposing political ideologies towards immigration on the left and the right betray, I think, dangerously corresponding logics of power. And I don't mean across the board. I'm speaking specifically in terms of immigrant disposability. It's an alignment here that I think effectively, if unwittingly, amounts to an unholy alliance around the disposability of immigrant lives and the perpetuation of segregated time. So by considering immigration in terms of segregated time as opposed to just segregated space, I want to suggest or make a case for a dimensional perspective that to acknowledge and contest what we might call the racialized marks of the border that go missing when migration is addressed in terms of territoriality alone. At the same time, I want to invoke a biopolitical framework, but I want to disturb the periodicity that's often attached to that concept, or for those of you who've read Foucault, because it's not. When I think about biopolitics, I think about how race decides or marks the border between who lives and who dies. And race is figured in terms of who falls below or outside of the human race, and it's not as opposed to a concept that supplants or makes bygone or obsolete old forms of state sovereignty. I think Ariane and I agree quite strongly on this, that it's not, that we can't talk about, because there's something like biopolitics, that muscular state traditional sovereignty has just gone by the wayside. It's that periodicity, the pastness of the past, the linearity of time that I think creates problems for us as we try to think about the logics of power that are happening in our own time. So from here, I think to get to the question of whether immigration is good or bad for democracy, I'd want to challenge the premise of the question and try to reframe it or challenge it with respect to segregated time. I think prevailing conceptions of time and the weaponization, I think, of dominant temporal vectors are relevant to precisely this issue of what democracy and which immigrants are presumed to augur change for the better or for the worse. The same can be said for the attendant rationalities that undergird arguments on behalf of each. So you could say, for example, in the context of a settler colonial nation such as the United States, which is founded on indigenous genocide and chattel slavery, European immigration has been integral to the formation and the upkeep of white-dominated liberal democracy. It's assisted and abetted the still ongoing dispossession of First Nations, as well as many of the country's historically entrenched exclusions and inequalities. And uncomfortably, it's the fact that tortured legacy of history of white democracy and racial capitalism is actually contiguous with a lot of the sitting president's views on which immigrations are good and bad. He famously wants to see more immigrants from Norway, and he wants to ban those from predominantly Muslim countries. Haiti, he said terrible things, they all have AIDS, and from African destinations that he profoundly denigrates, and I won't repeat that. Suffice it to say, I think the partisans of democracy are not well served by pro-immigrant calls to celebrate diversity that at the same time fail to attend to how power inequalities attach to these various forms of difference, and how those inequalities are often expressed as impositions, or experienced rather, as impositions on human time. I think for those of us who are aspiring to a more robust, even radical incarnations of democracy today, I think a lot hinges on us moving away from the notion of citizenship as tantamount to status in general and coextensive with the human in particular, as if only those who are afforded the status of citizenship are eligible to be fully human and treated accordingly. So if I think about this in terms of time and temporality, eligible follows the logic that says, someday we might consider treating you migrants as coeval citizens and human beings, provided we can make your difference useful, or better still, if we can convert it into sameness. But just not yet. The not yet of liberalism's temporizing universalism. And now in an era where a lot of people are saying never to foreigners, not just not yet, we also can't lose, I think, our sight of the corresponding uptick in modes of disciplinary power that range from the mundane and the everyday to forms of outright terrorism. So I think, to return to my point about the argument that I'm concerned about immigrants, valorizing immigrants for doing the work, the jobs that Americans can't do or won't do, it's difficult for me to see how, if we frame arguments in terms of what we, quote unquote, how we can best put those people to our use, how that ethos sufficiently challenges xenophobia and nativist sentiment on behalf of democratic inequality. More generally, I think that that instrumental rationality adds ballast to popular shifts toward thinking of citizenship in terms of status and away from citizenship measured otherwise, in terms of participation, in terms of democratic ethos. I think that, so to bring this to a close, I think that my concern is that once immigrant disposability is accepted as both desirable and inevitable, it then becomes a question of whether the attrition and the exploitation will be fast necropolitics, or if it's going to take the form of a kind of long-term attenuated slow wasting. To the degree that past and present are precedent, there's plenty of logics of amnesia that are available to segregate immigrant disposability from public memory as never having happened at all in a country that celebrates itself as a nation of immigrants. Our policies, our ways of being toward immigrants in America haven't been always as shiny and as welcoming as we might like to believe. So in other words, as long as people across the ideological spectrum agree on the indispensable disposability of immigrants, I think it really is just a matter of time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Elizabeth, and your work is engaged extensively with questions around temporality and the differential experience of classes of citizens under democracy, and in fact, most recently, about the experience of time under democratic regimes. And I know you're also working at the moment on a project on immigration enforcement and the experience of disciplinary power, particularly as it relates to immigration. So I invite you to offer your reflections on this topic as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the Mitchell Center, to Jeff, to Mitchell, for inviting us. And I really feel privileged to get to hear these remarks, and now I feel like I have a high bar to live up to. I also played with the question a little bit instead of answering the question about whether immigration is good for democracy, bad for democracy. I want to think a little bit about how opposition to immigration is bad for democracy. So just a low bar, but one that I think we can clear, because I think it kind of messes with our heads a little bit. As Osman mentioned, I'm in this mad dash to finish a book on immigration enforcement in the United States, and that's consuming my brain a great deal. So I've been shocked by what I've learned. I could shock you with an illustration of how enormous ICE's budget is right now. It's bigger than all the other law enforcement agencies combined budgets. I shock you with stories about how Customs and Border Protection is basically exempt from certain parts of Fourth Amendment protections. I can talk about how whenever we try to deport people, it turns out we also deport US citizens. And so I think that makes a plenty strong empirical case for why anti-immigration policies are bad for democracy, and underscores the point that probably the worst thing we can do for both people who are opposed to immigration and supportive of it is close borders, because it gets nobody anywhere. But I'll move on from the practical, because we're not having like a fully practical level discussion, and pick up on some of the themes that PJ talked about. So I just published this book on time and politics, and so I've been thinking a lot about time, and been thinking a lot about waiting in line and what it means for us to wait in line, or imagine that we're waiting in line, or believe that other people, for example, immigrants, might be waiting in line for citizenship or other basic goods that we associate with citizenship, elements of the American dream or work. And so I think we've all heard this kind of queuing talk, this idea that like we're in line, or that people are getting pushed out of line, or other people are cutting in line. It's really familiar to us now. And it is a temporal type of logic. And it's interesting to me to think about the fact that for a long time, like thinking about time meant you were really pro-immigrant, because you were looking for ways to enfranchise people who weren't in the country with status. So like our amnesty laws, when we've had amnesty, which is rarely, possibly only once, we looked for ways to justify turning people into citizens, and we looked for the time that people had spent in the country as a justification for putting them on a pathway to citizenship and eventually allowing them to regularize. Also looked at the amount of time that they'd been working. So for a really long time, no pun intended, we thought of this as a way for people to become citizens, their relationship to time. And around 2005, this counter-narrative emerges, and every time I talk about this, people challenge me that this happened so recently. But it's only since 2005 that the idea that immigrants are actually line cutters, that they're cheating, that they're jumping the queue in which possibly more legitimate immigrants are waiting, or that American citizens are waiting, that they are cheating in this way. Around 2005, you start to hear this come up. It's the rhetoric that was eventually adopted in the US by the Tea Party. I've had people tell me that it's also really powerful rhetoric in Australia as a means of combating or kind of pushing out asylum seekers and refugees. And so it wasn't the only anti-immigrant rhetoric of the Tea Party, but I do think it plays directly into some traditions of white nationalism in the US. And so it flips this script on how we use time in immigration politics. But it's been wildly successful, right? So it's really hard to imagine talking about anti-immigration politics in the US now without hearing somebody saying like, oh, if they just would get to the back of the line, everything would be fine. So it's changed us, and it's changed how we think. And I want to just point out a few things that have gone on once this framework was adopted. So a couple of reasons it's really powerful. First of all, it's hard to come up against somebody who's telling you that you're cutting in line because it's really facially neutral. We think of lines as first come, first served is really fair to a lot of people. And it's taking something that I think is ultimately pretty racist, which is like if you came here more recently and from countries that we're not familiar with, then you don't belong here. It's taking something that is at core, I think, racist, and making it very, very neutral, and allowing people who don't want to say things in racialized terms or to think of themselves as racist. Gives them an opportunity or a means to say this racist thing without sounding to themselves or they think others as if they are racist. And it reminds me very much of other conservative kind of anti-civil rights arguments that we've heard, like opposition to affirmative action as kind of a actual using civil rights language to try and undermine affirmative action. even in like this post-2016 climate where I think now Steve Bannon is telling us that we should really shed all vestiges of shame about theories of racial superiority, there are plenty of people who take great comfort in this line-cutting language because it allows them to sidestep that. If you've read some pretty popular social science, one book in particular, Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, but also for social scientists in the room, Kathy Kramer, The Politics of Resentment, you'll see that they are recording for us and telling us that lots and lots of their research subjects think about politics in this kind of ordered, queued up way that white working class and middle class Americans often see other people, strangers to them, cutting in line. There are some other reasons I think this once we start to think of ourselves as in line for things and then think of other people as cutting in those lines, that it messes with our head a little bit. If you think about your experiences in line, and everybody can take very few seconds to imagine an enraging moment you've had in a line, because it's happened to all of us. This had some attributes, this experience of being in a line. So it was relational. You were in a relational experience when you were in the queue. Once we imposed this idea that we're waiting in line for really important things that we really want, we're put into relationships with other people behind us, people in front of us. You probably spend a lot of time, which you view as an important investment in the line, and you have a status in the line because you are ahead of some people and behind others and moving toward your goal. The status of being a newcomer is really important in the queue. So this is why it's really relevant to immigration. The newcomer lets us all know, if we're already in the queue, that at least we're ahead of somebody, right? There's somebody behind us, and so we get a little status boost from that. I think that's giving a lot of cover for nativism that we're seeing right now. There are some behavioral aspects to a queue, and again, it will help if you imagine a time that you were in a line. You form relationships with people in a line, so you have possibly a relationship to people around you. You might even ask somebody to hold your place for a little while because you get to know them just a little bit, and they will do that, but there's a limit, and after a certain point, if you try to get back in, other people will be angry. And this is actually quite significant. So it turns out sociologists have observed and demonstrated that your neighbors might be your compatriots in a line, but you expect people to enforce the queue. So this is really quite significant. If you don't enforce the queue, like if you let somebody cut in front of you, you will make other people really enraged. So this gets us policing ourselves, which I think is something you probably think a lot about. Now we citizens are kind of policing each other. We're not so interested in the state doing the policing. We're really interested in whether people around us are letting other people jump the queue. And so if, for example, you were imagining as a Republican or a conservative or an anti-immigrant activist that people on the left or Democrats or pro-immigrant activists are trying to let somebody or a group of people jump the queue, then you're going to view them as your enemy, even though you're supposed to be co-citizens thinking about these issues together and deciding together. All of a sudden, you're now actually viewing your co-citizens as enemies and people who are undermining, as some like to say, law and order, the queue being the order. And that's part of the reason that's really enraging is because we think that first come, first served is really fair. So the minute we start to think about political goods, something so precious as citizenship, as something that we should get by waiting in line, going to the first, and then the next, and then the next, and somebody comes and you're told they've upended the queue, they've totally screwed up the system, you think that's radically unfair. So one reason that we employ security guards at hospitals is because people are so attached to first come, first serve that if you enter an emergency room and you see somebody get served ahead of you, it will, even though you know probably there's a very good reason that the triage happens that way, it tends to create fights. People really don't think that's fair. Another thing that happens to us, that happens to our brains when we start to think that political goods are being distributed in queues that we're in, is that we think of the time that we spend waiting for whatever thing it is, a job, a slot in higher ed, the American dream itself. We tend to think of the time and our place in the line as our property. So we become quite attached to it. And if somebody were to disrupt that queue, or you're told that they're jumping ahead and getting your thing before you get to have it, then you start to think that they've stolen something from you because your time was your property. This is crazy, right? Because citizenship is not assigned to first come, first served. And even with respect to immigration, which is our subject, the opportunity to enter the country or to stay in the country or to become a citizen, none of these things are distributed in a single queue that we're all waiting in. So even visas, for which people do wait, aren't distributed in one precise queue. Furthermore, citizenship is a non-scarce good. So we don't have to go mining like in the Arctic to find more citizenship if we give a lot of it out. And we're not running out of citizenship. There's an artificial scarceness imposed by the state, but if there actually were to be a line, there'd be no reason for that line because we don't have to produce it in a slow period of time and then hand it out bit by bit. So this kind of shores up an idea, a really false idea, I think, of an imagined community. But the queue metaphor, this idea that people are in a line and that others are cutting in line, it's really reorganized a set of relationships and put us in competition with each other in some powerful ways. So if you look at Red State News, you will see quotes from immigrants, so people who came to this country, naturalized, saying that they're angry that other people are coming to this country in different ways and not doing it the right way and jumping the queue. It is turning us all against each other. You see this really powerfully in the Hoax Shield book. And so I think that is, I think I'm probably running low on time, but I think that is something to really focus on, the way in which this particular frame for opposition to immigration has poisoned democratic discourse about citizenship and immigration in our demos.
Thank you. Well, I know I have a lot of questions for the panelists, but I'd like to open it up for discussion to our audience, because I'm sure many of you do as well. And I know we have some visiting students in the room, I think, so I wanted to give the students the first opportunity to ask a question if you would like to. Maybe I'm mistaken. I see someone laughing back there. Are you? No? No? Then let's just open it up to the floor. Any questions? Matt has a microphone. Yes?
To the last speaker.
I think it's a microphone. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry. To the last speaker. Last week, I was working the polls for a Democrat in Northeast Philadelphia who won, a guy named Joe Hohenstein. But there were Republicans there, and they were talking, and the exact thing that you were just referring to about, I'm okay with people coming here as long as they get in line, is almost a direct quote from this Republican guy. And he was talking to another guy, and I didn't really want to engage in that. But I guess I'd like to know what you would say directly to someone like that if you had the opportunity. How would you counter that argument or that statement?
And maybe we'll take one more question. Charles? In the front.
Thanks to all of you. So my question goes to kind of considering in a more comparative perspective issues around immigration. I wonder what role we should ascribe to the political economy of different countries. So two issues in particular come to mind, one being kind of the age of neoliberalism and welfare retrenchment. How does the possible correlation between immigration and neoliberal reforms play into the politics of immigration? And another aspect of that would be the attempt of states to kind of lure highly educated people to come to their countries. That's maybe also part of this particular neoliberal era where states compete for well-educated workforce. Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to start?
Sure. Let me take this question about how we counter the frame, and it's a really hard, it's like a really easy question to pose and a really hard one to answer, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and so I think that for somebody, I think there's two types of people just using this frame. It's essentially a nativist frame. It's saying like, I was here first and other people were here later and firstness matters more. If you're really, really nativist, I don't think there's any countering the frame because there's deeper things underneath there that have to do with race, and we have to get at those questions of like, why do you think you're more American than somebody else, to the person saying that. So that's half a response. But to people who have kind of been persuaded to this, who've been told like, oh, there are rules and rules aren't being followed and that's disturbing to them, I think then we can introduce kind of comfortable sets of rules about who gets to do what when, that remind people that there's more than just waiting in line, that we often don't think that people get things just because they get somewhere first. We also think that people get things because they need them, or because they deserve them, or because it's good for everybody. So I think there's lots of other kinds of reasoning that we can offer people, unless they're just really hardcore nativists and will not let go of that, okay? So that's not like a really easy answer, but that's the best answer I can think of.
Would you like to tackle?
Yeah, I can try to answer this one from a comparative perspective. So the relationship between immigration and global policy, especially neoliberal aspect of it. So point number one, some people argue that immigration is a dark side of globalization. That actually liberalism, economic liberalism, capitalism fuel immigration, and for better or worse, and we go back to the distinction between good and bad immigrants, highly low-skilled immigrants, and so on. As I mentioned before, I think that's a sterile perspective. Okay, we don't go too far. The second point is I focus on the pull factor. Okay, why immigrants want to go to a certain country when they have the choice. So I'm talking only voluntary immigration, which is a tiny percentage of all migrant flows. Okay, just you have to be aware of that. I had colleagues who conducted research in refugee camps in Iraq. And as good Americans, they were confident that most of the refugees they interviewed wanted to go to the US. And they were surprised that actually most of the refugees say, oh, no, we did homework. We want to go to Sweden. In the US, pension, healthcare, I mean, no way, we want to go to Sweden. So of course, it's part of the pull factor, but only for a tiny percentage of immigrants who had the choice to decide their country of destination. And third point, when neoliberals, and I'm talking about the European conception of neoliberalism, which is slightly different than the American one. But in Europe, some neoliberals said, if we stop immigration, everything will be fine. And as you guess, I'm referring to the Brexit. It was one of the main arguments. We're going to get rid of European constraints. We're going to stop immigration, and it will be great. Well, guess what? I don't know if we are going to have a final agreement. Theresa May is still fighting, but we know for sure that there is a shortage of immigrants in the US. And most of the anti-immigrant discourse was fueled by the rejection of European immigrants. The Polish plumber, for example, there was the big myth about the invasion of Great Britain by Polish workers. Well, guess what? These European immigrants didn't want to stay in the UK. They were part of circular migration, okay, to work a few years in the UK, go back to Poland, go back to Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on. So now there is no incentive to go to the UK, and as a result, the UK has to import now non-European immigrants, meaning people of color, which was not exactly the purpose of the pro-Brexit supporters. That's the irony of history.
PJ?
Sure. Neoliberalism, of course, is a huge concept, very contested. People get upset about it. But also, I'll try to seize on one part of this and speak to your question. Part of neoliberalism that I hear over and over again, if there's to be some agreement about it, is that, well, every human being, every person is their own brand, as Foucault said, an entrepreneur of the self. And then so when we're going to talk about race, we should talk about, well, what does that do? What does that mean in terms of racial difference, given that population flows have been racialized and stigmatized? And I think that from there, we can talk about to the extent to which racial stigma functions as a stigma of debt, of that is those who owe a debt to society, deviance, for example, those who owe a civilizational debt that should be paid back by a particular kind of behavior over their lifetime of gratitude. Think about, even in our own politics, about how offended certain people get in terms of if there's not a display of gratitude. It's not just exploitation that's desired, it's that the subject that's being exploited articulate gratitude for their own exploitation, right? I think that there's, from here, there's a kind of dynamic of what I'd like to think about as being living on borrowed times. We're not, to the extent that we're not addressing these issues, but I see a potential kind of fissure point, right, between the neo-nativists and the racists who on Elizabeth's point, who aren't just saying wait, like seeing foreigners as immigrants and waiting, but are saying never, right? And those who are looking for cheap labor, and that ethos imperils their ability to get that labor. So from one end, it says, well, you have people saying, well, don't let your bigotry get in the way of my greed, and then the other people saying, well, don't let your greed get in the way of my bigotry. So there might be a tension there politically.
Some more questions here, I think, Eric and Matt.
Hi, thanks. I'm just wondering if there are any differences between the panelists on the question of whether there is a legitimate reason to restrict immigration and what that might be. So I'd like to hear the differing views, if there are any.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, hi, I'm Eric Orts from across the street at Wharton, and my question follows directly on that question. Do anyone on the panel, kind of thinking about the broader picture of threats of immigration, and I take the point that there's lots of different kinds of immigration, but I recall an old argument by Michael Walzer, who said that democracy actually can be threatened by very heavy increase of immigration, and the reason that he gave was the difficulty for the assimilation process that you've been talking about. And so on that basis, I just wonder what the panel thinks about that. Is that actually a threat? And maybe the example of Germany would be one of the main claims. And I think even thinking forward, climate change could increase the number of refugees significantly to all of the modern democratic states, and it seems like that could be a major threat. And I just wonder what the panel thinks about that argument. Is that a reason to try to keep people out because of a need to preserve the systems of democracy that are in place, or are there some other alternatives?
Can I start with you again?
Yeah, okay, so open border or closed border, okay? Open border from a theoretical perspective is supported by proponent of global redistributive justice. That's the cosmopolitan perspective. If we can't equalize access to resources, we should allow people to move where there are more resources. Okay? That's the global framework. It's very nice, very attractive, but as I mentioned, is not sustainable for many reasons. So when I criticize the practices, the current practices of border controls, it doesn't mean that I'm in favor of open border. A kumbaya spirit, we should welcome everybody. It makes no sense. It's not feasible and it makes no sense. And it makes no sense, and here I'm referring to the difference between ethics of responsibility and ethics of conviction. Some people will say, ethics of conviction, we should help all the vulnerable populations, we should welcome all the refugees, immigrants, economic immigrants, illegal immigrants, and so on. That's ethics of conviction. And I say, okay, that's very nice, but what do you suggest to do in terms of integration? It's very nice to say, we open the door, open the border, and then what? What happened? What happened to the people we allowed to enter the country? And that's very interesting because you have a large group of people who say open border, open borders. And when I start to engage the discussion about, okay, what happened to the people once they're here? Well, there is almost no one in the room, okay? They all find something else to do. Ethics of responsibility. A leader of a country has the right, the duty to protect the territory, to protect the citizens. And there is a distinction between citizen and non-citizens. And it will be unfair, as you mentioned, to go back to your metaphor of waiting in the line, that non-citizen would enjoy all the rights that are, usually for citizens. It will be unfair. Legal immigrants are extremely critical to illegal immigrants. There is some interesting poll survey asking legal immigrants in this country, what do you think? Do we think we need a more restrictive immigration policy? The majority of them say yes, because they fear the backlash effect on their own perception and their life in the United States. So, of course, we need border controls. We need to select, we need to manage immigration. Does it mean more or less border control? This is practicalities. And I say visa policy should be reformed. It will be much more effective. So of course we need, but what I reject is the dichotomy of restrictive or liberal immigration control. Makes no sense. This is too vague. And on what criteria? Yeah, most illegal immigrants, as I said, are visa overstayers. At some point, they were documented. But this is maybe some people will say undocumented, although they're not undocumented because they have documents. Most undocumented immigrants are more documents than I do because I don't have a driving license. Try to survive in this country without a driving license. And I guess an American citizen, but I don't have a driving license. So yes, we can discuss for hours, for days, for years, the categorization, how we name people and group and so on. And you're right, but at the end of the day, we have to decide policies and we have to implement these policies in a democratic way with transparency and equity.
Elizabeth?
Just two practical, well, maybe 1.5 practical points. With respect to the idea, is there immigration that any of us would reject? I think this maybe came up for a moment in our discussion and then was dropped, but I think we should be thinking really carefully about the movement of people, like young able-bodied people or brain drain, things like that, from parts of the world, from many parts of the world to a few parts of the world. So I think we should be thinking about this kind of, and I think there's a political theorist who calls the policies that grow out of this Olympic citizenship, this idea that kind of some countries can siphon off what they view as resources, not even really as human beings. And then something else that came up that I think I want to highlight as a response to the second part of this set of questions is I think that the more free movement we have, the less we have to worry about the question of kind of, can we handle this? Because it is quite empirically the case that the border controls trap people who don't necessarily want to stay somewhere in particular, but would like to be mobile or would like to be able to go back and forth between several places. And we end up with a larger population of undocumented, but also a larger immigrant population when what we have are people who would like to be transnational. So, and that's always been the case, like in the border zone in the United States, that really these were transnational areas that were ultimately forced to not be that way, and so trapped a lot of people. Sociologists call it kind of enclaving. I don't know if, though, to speak to the Michael Walzer point, if the nation that he was imagining when he wrote that did exist, and I definitely don't think it does anymore. So I'm not sure that the threat would be the same.
Yeah, I mean, and from a, to set the practical aside for a second, because I'm not sure how you test for this, right? One thing that I'd want to talk about in terms of dangerousness is one's commitment to pluralism. If we're supposed to be talking about democracy, however it's conceived, right? Even the most anemic notion of democracy would have to affirm some notion of agonistic existence with those people of difference. Now, like I say, how do you test for that at the border, right? When somebody comes in, whether or not they want to be part of a coherent political project that's dedicated to that particular ethos, well, that's another set of questions. But I mean, it also does raise a question about the people who are citizens of this thing that we like to think of as a coherent political project, but seems pretty incoherent some days, most times, depending on what mood you catch me in. And what about them? They're not affirming. You have plenty of people who don't affirm the pluralism and tenets of democracy. Like I say, even at a baseline level within our own borders, right? So I think there's a couple of questions that can be asked along those lines in terms of, well, what, and I think it has consequences for how whether or not it even makes sense for people to the extent to which we can consider ourselves part of a coherent political project. Because if I go around the room in my classes that I teach and I say, what do you know about American history? I get as many more answers than the people that are in the class, right? But when somebody goes to take an immigration test, there's certain things that they seem to have to know in order to pass that test. But there's not a certain set of things about the country that people have to know if they're from Texas and New Jersey, for example. So I think there's a lot at stake in what you're asking.
If I might just add one thing on what you said, PJ, in response a bit to Eric's question on this point on pluralism and diversity of value and belief. And I think this connects to what Ariane has been discussing about integration, what happens after people arrive. And I asked this question, I want to pose the question of what does a well-integrated immigrant look like? What does a well-integrated immigrant look like? And when we speak about integration, who are we talking about? Who needs to integrate? Who needs to conform? On what terms? Right?
What?
I think integration is always a two-way process. that involves both the adjustment of the quote-unquote native population and the adjustment of the migrants. In the German case, just as Turks have to become more German, whatever that means, Germany becomes more Turkish in the process. There's something there about multiculturalism and how the society into which one is ostensibly integrating into changes by the presence of diversity as well. And one last point I'll make about this, this relates, PJ, to what you were saying about debt and obligation. What do we think people owe to us by virtue of the gift of citizenship or the gift of allowing them to enter our countries? When you think about the politics of integration, how it plays out, especially in many Western European countries today, there's a lot of rhetoric about shared values and beliefs. These things become, Elizabeth, as you put it, neutralized, maybe racialized questions become displaced to the terrain of culture. Certain cultures have bad beliefs, let's say. They have anti-feminist beliefs, they have anti-pluralist beliefs, they have anti-democratic beliefs. We hold newcomers to a higher standard than we would perhaps our own citizens, right? So if the question is that immigrants ought to conform to the purported shared values of a political community, and if we can enumerate what those values are, does that mean that the existing native indigenous citizenry who does not share in our values of pluralism, diversity, feminism, should their citizenship be stripped away? Right? There's an extra test, I think, put on newcomers to conform to a set of values that perhaps many members of the existing society, they themselves do not hold. So I think there's a lot there when we try to unpack what integration looks like, what a well-integrated immigrant might look like, in what ways do they have to change as newcomers to a society, and what ways does the society have to change in response to their presence? So just some thoughts. Maybe there's some more questions. There are. Gio and Nate?
Thank you. Actually, this relates directly, I think, to what Osman just raised. And I know it's 2018, so we're fighting a defensive battle against white nationalist nativism. But I also wanted to hear more, I think, about migration not as a threat to democracy, but as a source for democratic quality, right? And transformation. And I think this relates to a much broader question, which is what's called the boundary problem, like who is allowed into the demos of democracy. And people use this to raise provocative questions about, for example, if the United States can support a coup in Honduras that then drives out a wave of migrants, why can't Hondurans vote in US presidential elections? But it also reminds us of the ways in which these exclusions are not simply about inside and outside of citizenship, but also cut across the polities as well. And I think about, of course, mass disenfranchisement today, mass incarceration in particular, but also about W.B. Du Bois talking about the way in which the abolition of slavery and black suffrage meant not only a quantitative difference in terms of people being included in democratic participation, but a qualitative transformation, what he called abolition democracy, the way in which democracy got better for everyone as a result of the abolition of slavery and participation of Black Americans. And so I'm wondering what people think about the potential, rather than simply talking about what's dangerous, about migration, what is potentially fruitful.
Thank you.
Okay, that was an important and complex question I don't want to detract from. But I have a general question for any or everyone, which is just given the global scale of migration today, as Jeff mentioned in the introduction, but also given the vast differences in types of states, size, economics, regime type, capacity, do you think that different states should have different responsibilities for accepting immigrants in different ways, especially given particular histories of, say, violent engagements in certain parts of the world or not. Or, I mean, in the Sweden and or versus the US discussion, I mean, it's not just a question of where does the immigrant want to go, but who will accept them and why. So are there differences in how states should accept immigrants normatively?
EJ, can I start with you this time?
Sure. Well, a lot on the table here. So I think the way that I would, I just want to point something out that sometimes gets taken for granted just depending on what circles you move in. What Gio's point about about migration and pluralization and so on, I think it gets at, like, well, how are we conceiving of democracy? Is democracy, we're going to have this, is it just going to be a kind of a set of institutional structures, one person, one vote, or are we willing to say that, take a more, say, radical democratic ethos, which is what I take Du Bois to be getting at, that it's not just simply enough that I affirm you as a rights-bearing individual, for example, in some abstraction, or I tolerate you because I'm such a wonderful, magnanimous human being, because it's always nice I tolerate somebody else. That's really condescending. It's if we take it further, then it means democracy means asking what it means to treat other people who as equals without conflating equality into sameness. And what does it mean to have a commitment to not just pluralism, that is the existing panoply of diversity that we inhabit right now, but also pluralization, which I take Gio to be getting at in terms of, well, the possibility that encountering other forms of difference, which is one thing that happens by way of migration, might have something to say about that in terms of expanding the horizons of our political imagination, as well as whom the kind of the variety of difference with whom we keep company in. But also,